Okay, Scott, you ready to get started? I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay, first of all, welcome everyone to our very first virtual date with history. Those of you who know us at the First Division Museum know that we have been conducting these date with histories for a long time. However, due to the current state of affairs, COVID-19, we are all doing a lot of things differently. So this is our first virtual date with history, and we are so glad that you can join us. Before I introduce our guest speaker for this evening, I would like to go over a few housekeeping notes. So first of all, this virtual date with history will follow the same format that we have always followed. The last 15 minutes will be set aside for questions and answer. And the way that will work is you will use the question and answer button on the bottom of your computer. Please do not use your hand raise feature. Use the question and answer button at the bottom of your computer. When you do that, one of my teammates, many of you know Miss Laura Sears, there she is. One of my teammates will be in charge of all of that. Once you use that button, she is going to get to as many questions as she possibly can, so we can make this a very fruitful night for each and every one of us. The last housekeeping note I would like to do is just apologize in advance if we have any audio or visual hiccups. We do not perceive that. We have conducted a lot of technological checks and rehearsals, so we think everything will go just fine. So without any further ado, so now I'm going to read, because I want to make sure I get the bio exactly right, and introduce our guest speaker for tonight. Cord A. Scott has a doctorate in American history from Loyola University here in Chicagoland, where we are in the First Division Museum. You'll find out later, and you can probably see from his slides, he's not in Chicagoland right now. Actually, he currently serves as a professor of history for the University of Maryland at the Global Campus for Asia, and we'll talk about that, what that means in a second. He is the author of Comics and Conflict, as well as Four Color Combat. He has written for several encyclopedias and also several journals, to include the International Journal for Comic Art, the Journal of Popular Culture, the Journal of the Illinois State Historical Society. And he has also written for several books on aspects of cultural history. His most recent work is on USMC cartoons and the World War I version of Stars and Stripes. And he currently resides in Osan, South Korea. And we spoke earlier. I let him know I spent 2 tours in Korea, so I know exactly where you are, Scott. And we really appreciate what you do, because I understand when you are a professor overseas, you do a great service for our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and their families, and diplomats and civilians, and anyone who's serving overseas who would like to further their education. So we appreciate what you're doing, and we also appreciate you for joining us tonight. So it's your show, sir.
Well, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate it. And good evening, everyone, or welcome from the future, because it's 14 hours ahead. So we're currently a little after 9 o'clock in the morning here in Korea. But just a minor little item, the shirt I wanted to show you is I have my Cantini shirt. I have a connection back to Cantini because in 2008, they were actually the ones to sponsor me as I went with the Canadians on the battlefield tours of Sicily and Italy. So I have great connection and affinity for Cantini. So I'm happy to be conducting this first virtual date with history as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump on into it. And then if you have any questions about my background or anything else when we get to the Q&A session, please don't hesitate to let me know. Cantini's staff will also have some of my communications ties. So if you have any questions and you want to get a hold of me later on, I'm more than happy to answer those as well. So with that said, let us begin. So normally when I'm talking about comics, I often want to go through a very brief history of where comics come from. And the idea of comics really started with a gentleman by the name of Richard Outcault, who was famous for creating something called the Yellow Kid, which ran in the New York papers in 1896. If you're familiar with general history, this is the era of what we call yellow journalism. It's also where a lot of communications forms are really starting to come into their own. Outcault's cartoon was rather important because it not only was considered the first cartoon to be published in papers, but it was also done with a hook in mind, which was they used yellow ink, hence the phrase the Yellow Kid. It was also important because there was a fight going on back and forth between a couple of newspaper publishers in New York, one of which is a guy by the name of William Randolph Hearst, and the other one was Joseph Pulitzer. And they were fighting about who was going to publish this cartoon because it was such a draw for the newspaper sales. And subsequently, one of the other things that was rather important was the fact that when these color cartoons often came out, they came out on specific days, which were Sunday, hence the Sunday Funnies. So the idea is that with this general cartoon that came in the turn of the century, it led to a whole slew of other formats. One of the Little Nemo and Slumberland was another one done by Winsor McCay around the turn of the century. The Katzenjammer Kids also being rather important. This became a staple of a lot of newspapers. They would often try to find a cartoonist to bring on staff. So what happened was, and I'm going to come back to Stars and Stripes here in just a minute, but as we go through the 1910s and 20s, coming into the 1930s, we are in the middle of the Great Depression. You now see this push to try to get people to buy comic books. You know, how can we get people to buy more of these ideas? So what they did was they took a standard news sheet, folded it again, and this came up with a 32-page booklet that we know of as the comic book, at least in its current form and pagination. The idea was that originally the comic books were nothing more than reprints of the Sunday Funnies. But as this industry really started to take off in the later 1930s, you started to see very specific comic book characters being created. And that too is something we're going to come back to rather extensively this evening. So this is the general overview of where comic books come from. Now, where this gets really interesting is the fact that comics are not only a form of just the sign of the times, but they're also a way for people to rally around certain concepts. The one that we often think of, and the one I've written about extensively, was Captain America. Captain America came in at a very specific time frame right before World War II, or U.S. entry into World War II. But it's also a very latent symbol of American ideals. So one of the issues that I wanted to bring up, though, was going just back a little bit to Stars and Stripes. Stars and Stripes had been around during the Civil War, and they had been discontinued. Stars and Stripes, as we know it, was first published in early 1918 during the First World War. And they did actually have a staff cartoonist, a Marine with the 2nd Infantry Division, a gentleman by the name of Wally Walgren, who did the normal 3-panel strip, which appeared every Friday on page 7. The image that you see right in front of you is also from a very famous 1st Infantry cartoonist, a gentleman by the name of Avian Butler. Butler's book, incidentally, is available in the bookstore when the bookstore reopens at Cantini. I had to be reminded of that, so it's kind of a bummer. But this particular image was one of Butler's drawings from a book called Happy Days. And it's rather interesting because if you look closely in the upper left corner, you see the 4 main infantry divisions, 2nd, 3rd, 1st, and we presume that this would be the 4th Infantry Division representative talking about who's who won the war. The gentleman right here who's looking at this, thinking about the Statue of Liberty, is actually with the occupation forces in Koblenz, which is another rather important feature to this entire story. The idea is that these comics are a way for both combatants to vent what they've seen before them, but also make light of certain things. This particular image I often use because it's, again, Butler in the 1st Division, but it's also this reference to the German schoolboys who unfortunately would later become officers in Nazi Germany in the 1940s. But this is a good example of where something as simple as a cartoon panel can be used as a form of history. I use this often in my my American history classes. So moving forward, though, as we start looking at comic books and their development, this is the era where you get what is called the golden age of comics. This is where you're going to get the 2 high schoolers from Cleveland, Siegel and Schuster, will create Superman, who will first appear in Action Comics 1938. You'll get Batman being created at roughly that same time frame. And then finally, Captain America will come in 1940. The comic books themselves are, again, it's a rather interesting subfield in its own right, because a lot of the artists which were associated with comics often would work under pen names because they didn't want to hinder their own professional artistic endeavors, because comic books were often seen as a lesser field, if you will. So it's oftentimes you have to dig a little bit to find out who's illustrating some of these comic books, but they often are important because they do represent their own form of artistic work. Comics often represent a form of escapism as well as a form of adventure. Most people can instantly recognize a comic book character. Perhaps they've not read them, but they oftentimes can say, oh, that's Captain America, or that's Black Panther, or that's Superman, or Batman, or so on. The characters themselves, oftentimes the stories are written in a very similar aspect to something along the lines of pulp fiction books, adventure stories. They're oftentimes full of fighting and dramatic moments. They are serials in many regards. As the real politics of Europe start to change, you start to see the comic books starting to come into that realm of dealing with the events in the news as well, now being brought into storylines within the comic books. For example, one of the ones that I often try to use, I'm going to go forward here just a second so I can show you this one, would be Superman. This particular image was of Superman, interestingly enough, being involved in the fighting in Europe before the United States. This ran in Look magazine, hence the reason why the colors are rather odd. But in this simple 3-page storyline, Superman comes in, grabs Hitler, and then grabs Stalin and takes them both to Geneva to the World Court and puts them on trial for their egregious crimes against humanity. So it's a rather interesting twist on things. Let me go back here just a sec. And so the idea is that with these characters, they're now being used in the news so that people can go, oh, okay, now they might have more of a connection to what's going on in the world around them. As far as patriotically driven characters are concerned, we often think of Captain America, and he's by far the most famous, but there were a wide variety of other characters as well. In fact, there was a character that preceded Captain America as a red, white, and blue clad figure who would represent America, and that would be the Shield. Another one that obviously comes into this realm of illustrated characters that embody America would be Uncle Sam, which incidentally, Uncle Sam became its own comic book at one point. So there were several that were used. As far as Captain America, though, Captain has had a rather interesting background. The first issue of Captain America was published in 1940, a full year before the United States was officially involved in the war. And while the origins of Captain America have been rather speculative to keep them, ambiguous enough that everybody could relate to them, there was a more recent comic book that came out in 2006, which did have Captain America originating with the 1st Infantry Division. So, in fact, the one that I will go forward to here in just a minute will be from that later issue. Some of the other characters that come from this time include the Shield. Captain America, if you've ever seen the original Captain America issue number 1 from 1940, it has Captain America punching Hitler in the face on the cover of the very first issue. So it certainly was not subtle in its depictions of what the two characters, Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, thought of Hitler. Later on, they were asked whether or not they were trying to have some sort of political bent towards the American view of the war, and they said no, he was just a great villain, so we figured we'd throw him in on the first issue just for the shock value, for lack of a better phrase. So some of the other characters that I've referenced, U.S. Agent would be another one. Many of these characters often will have an alter ego which would have some sort of military connection. U.S. Agent was a Marine. Captain America is in fact a private in the U.S. Army. SHIELD was the son of an FBI agent who had been killed in the line of duty. So there's often this parallel connection between superheroes and the military in some form or another. For many of these comic books that were coming out in 1940 and 1941, a lot of them were driven for both the American and the Canadian audience. But Canada was involved in the war, but America was not. So it's kind of we can kind of see where this is going, or at least it makes for an interesting storyline. By the time that Pearl Harbor occurred, you had several cartoon or comic books that now start to shift into this realm of supporting the American war effort. One of the first comic books that tries to take on an immediate historical bent is one that was called Remember Pearl Harbor. And it talked about the description of the attack, what led to it. And then it often gave smaller stories about what young readers in particular could do to help support the war effort. In addition to the fantasy version, the characters that we often read about that clearly have no connection to the quote real world, there were some comic book producers that wanted to have that historical mindset. And so several companies did start to produce what were called historical stories done in simplified comic book form. And those might include Real Comics, war stories, and True Heroes, which were either done by Dell or Parents Magazine publishing. So by late 41 coming into 42, this is where you're starting to run into issues with the Canadian comics, where they're trying to bring up their own patriotically driven characters. There's also an issue where Canadian comics, by the middle part of the war, are going to be done in what are called the Canadian whites. They're more black and white and shades of gray rather than necessarily full color comic books. There's a part of the reason is they're trying to bolster the Canadian market and not bring in American comics, but at the same point, American comics are trying to appeal to the Canadian readers by occasionally bringing in Canadian storylines. And that was actually the crux of my second book, which I can explain at the end of this discussion. So this was from the comic book that came out in 2008 called Captain America Mythos. So you have in the storyline, you have Steve Rogers, the scrawny 98-pound weakling who will eventually be turned into Captain America. And he says that if he wants to join the American military, but more specifically, he wants to join his father's unit, which were the Blue Spaders. So again, the idea is that you're trying to get this connection back into the 1st Infantry Division. One of the things that I noticed about this panel is that if you look closely at the one on the right in the lower corner, the division patch right here is not for the 1st Infantry Division, it's for the 26th, which is the Yankee Division. So this is where there was a little bit of confusion. So, you know, divisions versus regiments and all of that. So the idea is that sometimes in these comic books, if you have somebody who's really looking at them with a specific eye, sometimes the mistakes can be occasionally glaring, but that's not to say that it's still a valid attempt. So the issue, this was the cover of the issue that we were talking about. This one's rather interesting because it actually goes back to the original design of the shield. If you look closely, hang on, I'm trying to pull I often use my cursor as a laser pointer. So if you notice, it's more of a lozenge type shield with Hitler in the reflection. So again, this plays off of the original Captain America #1 in 1941. But if you read the comic book, you often notice that the shield is round. Interestingly enough, that was due to a copyright infringement. The original lozenge shield on the left was considered a little too close to the Shield character who carried that one, and so that's why after Captain America #3, this is why he goes with the round shield that we're familiar with. This particular image, which was done in the 2008 comic, I particularly love it just because of the fact that it shows the invasion beaches at Omaha. But more importantly, these two characters are actually a nod to a later comic, a war comic done by Jack Kirby and Joe Simon. And it was based off of a World War II painting. So it's rather an interesting, subtle nod back to Kirby and Simon. So interestingly enough, for the first couple of years, Kirby and Simon were making this comic book. Captain America would often fight Bundists, which were Nazis within the United States, the German-American Bund, and they had open threats made against them, which oftentimes led to a rather odd comparison of just the life versus the comic book life, so to speak. Kirby and Simon eventually were both drafted into the military. Joe Simon spent his military service doing artwork as well as creating a comic book for the Coast Guard. And Jack Kirby was thrown into a line unit as a scout due to and he reported that it was due to his drawing skills for map making. So he was rather shocked by that, but a rather interesting story nonetheless. And so I'll do that. But anyway, at the same point when these comic books were made, there's a huge market for it. There's not just the stories of the main characters that are well known, such as Captain America, but you also have some of the comic books which are read not just by children but by adults, form of escapism. And these became so popular that the US military produced what were called the pony comics. If you're familiar with the V-mail system where they would take photos and shrink them down, the pony comics are done in actually smaller than a digest version, and they were done with very simple colors. So they're not, black and red are the two main inks that are used for these, but they're done in a simpler form, but they're meant to be another form of something that can be read by servicemen in the field. So you do have a fair amount of the Superman reprints. You do have a fair amount of comic books that are done with military ideas in mind, the Boy Commandos, the True Comics, as I mentioned earlier. these comic books were popular with a wide variety of readers. And this often brought up another really important problem. And that was for some of the younger readers who couldn't quite distinguish between the reality of what was going on versus the comic book reality. The fear was that, okay, what happens if, you know, you're a 9-year-old and you're reading Superman, and Superman can pick up tanks and smash everybody with them. But so why doesn't he just stop the war? And especially for a younger reader who, you know, hey, if Superman could do this, why couldn't he stop my brother from being killed in Europe or in the Mediterranean? And this created kind of a rather delicate situation. And so some of the comic book writers actually had to come up with some interesting ways of circumventing this. And probably the most famous of which was Superman. In the storyline that was written in 1943, Clark Kent was, you know, given his draft notice, and so he's trying to join the military. And the storyline is a rather interesting one because he goes in for his exam and he is so jazzed about joining the military, he actually inadvertently uses his x-ray vision, reads the eye chart 3 rooms over, and the guy who's examining him says, yeah, you're blind as a bat, 4F, and that's the end of it. So it was a rather interesting way to back him out of military service and, you know, giving false hope to readers. So you do have a lot of comic books trying to get involved with the war effort in a wide variety. You did have some comic books like The Boy Commandos, where these would be young kids who form their own military unit and they're advised by an actual serviceman. But the idea is that these, as children, they would be able to go behind the lines and do a wide variety of things, more fancy than anything else, but rather important for morale. It gives kids a sense of, hey, I'm helping with the war effort. Other comic books were heavily involved with the drive for war bonds. In fact, there was one comic book produced called How Boys and Girls Can Help Win the War. And the whole thing talked about, if you buy a war stamp or a war bond, what does that pay for? And so in a comic book form, it would say, you know, if you buy a war stamp, 7 cents will pay for a bullet for a .45 caliber pistol. You know, $1.95 will pay for an M1 carbine, something along that line. So it's rather interesting to see the breakdown, but at the same point, put it in such a way that little kids could understand about, okay, if you even donate a dime, it can tie into the overall war effort. So as far as other comic book creators, as with many cases during the war, there were a considerable amount of folks who were brought in. They wanted to do their effort, wanted to do their part for the war effort as well. Probably the most famous in the military sense would be a gentleman by the name of Will Eisner. Eisner was famous for creating a comic book character called the Spirit. And Eisner was rather, you know, he had a very successful run. And when he was eventually brought into the military, he was sent to Aberdeen Proving Grounds, and that's where he eventually worked on a couple of different base papers. And this eventually developed into something called Joe Dope. Joe Dope was a hapless character who was often brought in, you know, to what not to do. You know, don't leave your rifle in the ground. Don't stick it in the mud. You know, make sure that you maintain it properly. The Joe Dope posters became rather famous. And eventually the character was brought into a new augmentative publication for the military called Army Motors. Army Motors would take a standard US military field manual and say, yeah, you can look at this, but if you don't quite understand it, you may not be able to effectively fix what you need to. Army Motors allowed drawings and illustrations that have been developed by Eisner in his comic books to now be incorporated into these manuals. And now people who may not have the technical mannerisms to read the material can now look at the pictures and go, ah, okay. And this became rather successful. Army Motors still is produced, not in its original form, but it is produced to this day by the US military in something called PS Magazine, and I'll show you a couple of examples of that later on. Another very famous cartoonist and comic book creator was a gentleman by the name of Milton Caniff. Caniff, before World War II, was famous for producing a strip called Terry and the Pirates. And when the United States entered World War II, Milton Caniff wanted to join, but due to bad knees could not do so. And so what happened was he tried to incorporate a lot of his storylines into his comics. One he did produce for the US military was called Miss Lace, and it was meant more as a morale booster than anything. Miss Lace was often very provocatively drawn. Miss Lace was a variation of the Dragon Lady, which was a character done in Terry and the Pirates, often with a very slinky dress. Miss Lace was very, very important for morale, though, because one of the hooks that she did in the storylines was she would not date officers. She had much more of an affinity for enlisted personnel. So the idea is that, you know, she was really involved with the ideas of the working man or the working soldier, rather than necessarily the officers who always seem to have better food and uniforms, things of that nature. Milton Caniff was also important for creating a couple of smaller comics, which I'll get to here in a minute. How to spot an enemy character or an enemy soldier is one that I will reference here in just a minute. So, but that was another one of his items. So we've talked about Superman. So these are some of the early characters which were patriotically driven. This would be U.S. Agent over here on the left. This is a reproduction of the original Captain America #1. So again, you can see the original shield and his punching Hitler in the face. Incidentally, for the first 10 issues of Captain America didn't actually go to the front. He would often fight Nazis in the United States, you know, the fifth columnist, that sort of issue. The one on the right, this is probably one of the most obscure, but one of my favorite characters. This, in its original form, was Mr. Liberty, and later on he was given a battlefield promotion and became Major Liberty. The story is that this was a mild-mannered history professor who was imbued with the power of all fighting men in American military conflicts prior to that, so he became a skilled tactician and the like. All of these were done through what is now Marvel Comics, but every major publishing company had their own version of a red, white, and blue clad individual. So the comic book that you see on the left, The Adventures of My Career, this is actually the one that Joe Simon had worked on. So again, you're looking at kind of a recruitment poster, if you will, or a recruiting pamphlet. So it's a rather interesting one nonetheless. The Will Eisner, Joe Dope posters, this would be the one on the right. There were, I want to say dozens, 35 is what really comes to mind, but I'm sure that there's more than that. But again, the idea is that Joe Dope was often given an example of, you know, what not to do. Treat everything correctly and it will work for you. Joe Dope became kind of a model that the US military later went with in cartoon form, and that was Private Snafu. But the original Dope posters often have limericks, just trying to keep everything simple that everybody can remember. Hey, keep your equipment, you know, maintain your equipment. So as far as military publications and cartoonists, there are some rather interesting ones as well. For US military publications, I often refer to what I call the big three. And that would be Dave Brager, George Baker, and most importantly, Bill Mauldin. Mauldin was a cartoonist for Stars and Stripes. In fact, he was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for one of his drawings of the fighting in Italy at that point. Dave Brager was another cartoonist for Stars and Stripes who had worked on something called G.I. Joe. And basically, he was kind of a hapless character who was just kind of there for the duration, but he meant well, and he would often, rise to the challenge, so to speak. And George Baker was the one who did Sad Sack, and Sad Sack was featured in Yank magazine, which was another U.S. military publication. In addition to Yank and Stars and Stripes, you would often have various base publications would have their own cartoonists illustrating work. Sometimes these would not be professional cartoons. They just might be people volunteering to work with them. One of the last projects I was working on before I came to Asia was I was looking at some of the illustrations from Fort Huachuca and the African-American cartoonists with the 92nd Infantry Division. So it's a rather interesting subfield. And then finally, in addition to the comic books and some of the publications, you would often have posters. And those posters might be from guys like Will Eisner, and probably one of the most famous other illustrators to do U.S. military posters was Dr. Seuss, Ted Geisel. Geisel did several anti-malarial posters. If you're ever looking for something interesting as a kind of a shocking subfield, I would recommend a book called Dr. Seuss Goes to War, because you see some of Ted Geisel's political cartoons that he did for a civilian publication in New York called PM Magazine. PM. So the idea there was that some of those cartoons are, quite frankly, disturbing because they're very Seussian in their drawings, a lot of fantastical creatures and whatnot. But then you have Hitler in the middle of them, and you're kind of like, wow, that's something I didn't quite expect. So these would be the examples of the three main artists, and these are by no means the only three artists who worked for either Stars and Stripes or Yank. There are far more than this, but these are the three that you often see the most material from. Baker's Sad Sack is on the left. Bill Mauldin's drawings of Willie and Joe are in the middle, and then Brager's G.I. Joe would be on the right. So as far as the legacy is concerned, a lot of the military cartoons that were used often, like I said, developed offshoots in some form or another. Will Eisner, like as I mentioned, he had worked on Army motors. Later on, he still had a connection to the military. In 1951, they produced the first of what were called the PS magazines. These were small digest-sized booklets that were used to augment the U.S. field manuals. And PS magazine is still published by the military. They are no longer in a physical form. They're now digitized. They went fully digital in 2017. So as far as the Canadian Army was concerned, they went with a variation of Joe Dope, and within their CAM, Canadian Army Motors, they actually produced their own cartoon character called the Misadventures of Benny Boob. So, and later on, after the war, you do have in the civilian comic book market, you have another company called EC Comics formed, and they actually try to, rather than going with the fantasy version of warfare in comic books being a type of adventure series where nothing severely bad happens, EC Comics tried to add a realism to their comic books by hiring a lot of veterans, and some of their stories were rather shocking because you could go through and read them, and they're depicting things that you might not be ready for. And I'll show you some examples of those here in just a few moments. Blazing Combat was a war in comics. It was done in the 1960s. It actually only ran for 4 issues. It was commercially, it was not very successful, but it had a lot of people loved the stories. It was sort of an anti-war comic, but there was a lot of pushback from military bases, so they would not carry Blazing Combat on them. So as far as the comic books themselves, they're used to educate, inform, and entertain. That's often a real hook with these. They want to, get complex ideas across to people who might have a wide variety of educational levels. They want to give people a way to vent, so that's why you're going to, allow them to, make light of, mess hall food or drinking or things of that nature. So there's a wide variety of subject matter that often comes up with these comics. So before we get into some of the images I wanted to show you from the latter series of these, I just want to throw out the standard, hey, the next few of these images they either deal with very subjective terms, either stereotypes. There's a fair amount of violence with them, so just keep that in mind as we're going through. Again, this has always been one of the biggest complaints about war comic books, is that oftentimes that they make too light of this. They say, oh, we're fighting for this, but in the end, the good guys always win. There's never any problems, and if somebody dies, they die gloriously with no problems. The reality is far, far different, and that's been something that especially some publishers really tried to avoid and others tried to embrace head on, and that's where some of these images become rather important to look at. So these are both World War II examples. The one on the right is done by another cartoonist, World War II cartoonist by the name of Sanson. He did a comic called The Wolf, and this was a serviceman who was always looking out for female entertainment. Miss Lace, the drawing that you see right there, that's the Milton Caniff character. And again, done in a very sexual format. The drawings in Miss Lace were often compared to the pinups that would run in something like Yank magazine as well. So the 2 images the 2 pages on the left are from the complete title of this was How to Spot a Jap, and this was done in the U.S. Serviceman's Guide to China. Caniff wanted to assist U.S. servicemen, so this smaller comic book was done to show the distinctions between Chinese and Japanese as a race, and again, fairly stereotypical by today's standards. You read this and again, as it goes further into this, there would be the discussions of pronunciation of the English language, how they look, cheekbones, color of skin, things of that nature. And so it was, by today's standards, again, you'd look at this and go, yeah, it's fairly shocking. So, but again, it's part of the realm of history, and especially with all of what's been going on in discussions going on in the United States right now with images of what constitutes history. History sometimes is very difficult to look at head on. So the 3 images you see here, the one on the left is from the EC comic book, Two-Fisted, no, I'm sorry, it's Frontline Combat. The story is called Corpse on the Imjin, and basically the whole thing is told from a second person perspective. You're holding the soldier down, you're holding him in the water, you're seeing the bubbles come up as you're feeling the life go out of him. It's a fairly shocking storyline. But it's a rather important one to understand, because again, for the publishers of two-fisted tales in frontline combat. They wanted to show a realism, a brutality to the war that might not come up in other comic book publishers. Carlton Comics was one that did a wide variety of war comic books, and they were often very much in the, the good guys always win realm. The black and white one in the middle is from Blazing Combat. This actually shows a depiction of waterboarding for Vietnamese troops in 1967. So it's, again, another shocking issue that we wouldn't always expect. The one on the right is from a Carlton comic, and it actually shows the tunnel system in Vietnam. So as far as the image on the left here, this is actually from the 1968 PS Magazine manual for the use and maintenance of the M16A1. After the weapon was introduced in Vietnam, there were severe problems that came up very quickly, and so the U.S. military produced this booklet on how to effectively maintain the weapon in combat setting. And this book is still utilized now. Like I said, PS Magazine is still produced, but it's rather interesting because you can look at this and understand concepts that might be a little hard to understand if you're reading the book only, but if you can see the images, you can go, oh, okay, yeah, here's where the receiver, here's where the bolt sits, and you can figure out the system fairly quickly as far as visualizations. The title on the right, The New Avengers, this was something else that had been a little bit more of a recent addition. After 9/11, the Marvel Comics had worked out an issue with the Army Air Force exchange system, and so every year Marvel would produce a free comic book to give away at military bases in the PXs. So this is one of the issues that was made, and clearly they use all the main characters from the Marvel line: Silver Surfer, Punisher, Captain America, and Ghost Rider here. But the story in this one was a fictional terrorist group within the Marvel universe called AIM, Advanced Ideas and Mechanics. They're trying to take over the world, and they end up getting a hold of a military-grade satellite which has communications going back and forth, emails, video chats between soldiers in the field and their families and loved ones. The idea here is that if you are trying to disrupt communications, you're breaking down morale. So the idea is that by using these comic book characters, they get into the satellite system and retrieve the information because of the fact that they want to make sure that the morale is kept up for everyone involved. So this series ran until 2016 was the last year that they produced one. So, and I know that when I was living in Japan about 2 years ago at Yokota, they still were giving out some of the last issues, but they've since discontinued this entire line. So, and then, so as far as the legacy is concerned of the comic books, they're still used today. Comic book sales, while they're not what they once were, because of the changing nature of the industry, you do still see a connection with, either the military characters. You're starting to see subfields of military storylines becoming more active. The U.S. One Stop, which is an associative group for connection with veterans, they actually did a comic book a few years ago on what to do for signs of PTSD. And so this comic book was set up in such a way that people could recognize if they were having problems with PTSD and what would be some of the resources that they could access. So there is still a pretty significant connection between the military and the comic book industry as well. There have been discussions about using some comic books as well as other forms of digital media to try to either recruit or train military personnel for things like first-person shooter games and items of that nature as well. So I'm trying to watch my time here, and I'm a little bit late, so I wanted to just kind of throw these out here, and then we can open it up to questions. These are the covers of my two books. Unfortunately, like I said, Cantini's store is not open yet, but if you were looking for either one of these, the one on the left was Comics in Conflict, was produced by the Naval Institute Press in 2014. It's hardcover only, so it'll be a little pricier, but they're available at all the major bookstores. And then the one on the right, Four Color Combat, this one was done by W Brand Publishing, and this one is a soft cover, so it's a little cheaper, but either one of these are available. And the other one that I do not have a picture of, but would tie back into this, would be there is a forthcoming book out later this summer or early fall on the life of Bill Malden and his work. And I had actually written a chapter on Bill Malden's Korean War cartoons that he was drawing while he was here as a reporter. So, but anyway, so that's basically it. To give you everything in a nutshell, and I'll turn it open to questions and answers.
Great. Thank you so much, Cord. That was fantastic. I liked seeing some of my personal favorite superheroes showing up on the screen tonight. So thank you for that. We do have a couple of questions for you, and we do have some time. So if you have any last minute questions, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A feature. You can type in your questions there. They'll come right to me. But let's start off with a question I got. And this is specific to World War II comics, or comics that were produced during World War II. We talked a little bit about American superheroes that came out here. Were there any kind of equivalents in other countries? For example, in Germany or Japan, we see any other kind of like comic characters or cartoons that are coming out in those countries?
Not directly. The closest for Germany was actually the propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, that actually made fun of the United States by the fact that he had said in one of his publications that, you know, these two Jewish kids had created a mythical Aryans or mythical Superman, but, you know, we are the true Aryan Superman, so you don't quite see it in that regard. There were, now that being said, there were German cartoons. I have a collection of German military cartoons and manuals as well, but not necessarily in the superhero, you know, I'm Captain Adolf or something like that. That you don't quite see. Canadians, there were a couple of those, not Captain Canuck, but Johnny Canuck and Nirvana were Canadian themed superheroes. So there were some in the Western world, but not necessarily in the Axis power, so to speak.
All right, thanks. Excited about reading about them too. So I have another question here, and you did touch on this a little bit, so maybe you can expand on it. Are there any recent examples of comics that are addressing modern military? I know you mentioned PTSD as being one of the topics. Are there any other kind of issues that we see them tackling right now?
There are, I know that the Navy did a graphic novel called The Docs, which was talking about the medical service for the Marine, the Navy corpsmen. So that was rather important. And that one was done specifically to not necessarily recruit, but kind of honor them. I know that the Naval Institute is doing a fair amount of comics called, they have an imprint line called Dead Reckoning. And they're actually talking about things that were going on in Afghanistan. So they're almost like memoirs done in a comic book format. So you are seeing some of those in a modern sense. There is actually, if I may for a minute,
Please.
There is another organization out of, hopefully they won't mind I do this, called Full Magazine or Full Mag. It's actually they are personal interviews, but they're also basically biography war stories. So there's a fair amount of those, and this is meant more as along the line of, you know, basically a way of telling stories of personal issues. The guy who runs the publishing, one of his interviews was with one of the last Doolittle raiders. So the idea is that they're trying to bring this into a modern era. There are some, the other gentleman who I often think of in the modern context is Wayne Van Zandt, who Van Zandt has done a wide variety of comic book histories. So he did a history of the Korean War. He did a history of the Vietnam War. I just got done reading a 700-page graphic novel called Katusha, which it's a fictional story of a girl who was with the Russian army through the entire realm of World War II. So there are a fair amount of modern examples. Whether or not they're being done for recruiting necessarily is a little different. Hold that thought. I'll give you a good example. This is an example, would be one of the physical versions of PS Magazine. So just to give you an idea of what the general size of these are. So, and like I said, these are still being done even to this day. So if you need to look at how to run communication systems, now you get the example.
Perfect. So we have time for 2 more questions. So I'm just going to wrap up with these last 2. The first one I want to bring up is, how much influence did the military try to wield over the subjects that were presented by the cartoonists? Initially,
when they were specifically civilian markets, there wasn't a whole lot. They realized you should be coordinating, especially for the children's ones for like war bonds. But as far as like trying to limit content, that was a little less. It didn't happen as often as you would think. There's not a lot of artistic, thumb on the development. Malden, as an example, Malden took a couple of pretty big swipes at Patton when they were in Europe, and when Patton was still saying the officers will come into combat wearing ties, and Malden made a very famous cartoon where the sign is that everybody's going to be fined if they're not wearing their tie in combat, and the one guy saying, yeah, we're just going to take a 1,000-mile detour out this. Patton was furious and wanted Malden court-martialed, but everybody else is like, no, you can't do that. You got to let these guys vent. You got to let them have a way to just get this out. So there's not a lot of content control. I mean, certainly you don't want to do a lot of, you don't want to have a lot of, let's do everything and just destroy morale, but you want to be able to give them a way to vent. So great. So we have one question, and I'm actually going to answer the last question. So we have a question of, will this presentation be available afterwards so you can watch it again? Absolutely. We are recording this presentation and holding against any kind of hiccups on the computer, and we are recording, and we will be putting it up on our YouTube. So stay tuned. It will be available for you to share with friends and to watch again, so you can come and hear it again. But I do want to wrap up the evening tonight. So thank you to everybody for coming in. I hope that you're able to join us at our next virtual event, which will be Thursday, June 25th. We are doing military movie trivia night with Bag of Tricks. I know, right, Cord? You should come. It'll be super fun. So that will be virtual on Facebook. So no matter where you are in the United States or on the globe, you can come play trivia with us. The winner will be receiving a pizza party on the First Division Museum. I'll be sending you 2 Luminati's pizzas. So feel free to go on our Facebook event page to learn more about that, and we hope to play trivia with you in a few weeks. All right, everybody, have a great evening. Cord, thank you again. I'm going to give you a round of applause, Cord. Thank you very much. I hope it was entertaining and informative for everybody, and thank you. Thank you all for showing up.
Absolutely. Have a great evening, everybody.